It's a broken culture, it's a broken society, and hip hop is hurting things. But
The 1970s were a turning point for African American communities navigating a landscape where Jim Crow had officially ended, but systemic racism remained entrenched in every institution. Black neighborhoods developed sophisticated survival strategies that went far beyond what most people understand. These weren't just cultural quirks or community traditions. They were carefully constructed defense mechanisms against police violence, economic discrimination, and daily threats that white America either ignored or actively perpetuated. From coded communication systems to collective childcare networks, these practices reveal how entire communities organize themselves around a single imperative: keeping their people alive. Here are 20 of the most essential tactics, ranked by their impact and necessity. Number 20. Emotional armor training. Parents systematically taught children to suppress emotional reactions to injustice and trauma because visible anger or distress gave hostile actors satisfaction and could escalate already dangerous situations. Kids learned through repeated drills not to cry when called racial slurs, not to react visibly when teachers were unfair, not to show fear when police stopped them, even when terrified, and not to display anger when humiliated. This wasn't a healthy psychological practice, but it was protective in the immediate term. The benefit was the de-escalation of dangerous confrontations and denying racists the reaction they sought, the satisfaction of knowing they'd caused pain. The severe psychological cost manifested in depression, anxiety, emotional numbness, and difficulty expressing emotions appropriately even in safe contexts with trusted people. This armor, once constructed and hardened through repeated use, became almost impossible to remove. Generations carried cumulative trauma, and the 70s continued adding layers to existing damage. Mental health support was essentially non-existent. Therapists were overwhelmingly white and often actively harmful to Black patients, pathologizing normal responses to abnormal situations. Communities processed this collectively through church testimony, family gatherings, and friendship networks, rather than through professional treatment. The training also created problems in intimate relationships, as adults struggled to be emotionally vulnerable with partners, moving to the most comprehensive strategy. Number 19. Code words for police presence. Black communities developed elaborate systems of coded language to warn neighbors about police activity without drawing suspicion. Terms like "the library is open" could signal an impending sweep, while "visiting cousins" might indicate it was time to clear the streets. This wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The practice emerged from decades of harassment, arbitrary stops, and violent encounters that made law enforcement feel more like an occupying force than a protective service. These codes changed regularly to prevent outsiders from catching on, creating a linguistic arms race between communities and authorities. The positive side was the solidarity it created. Everyone looked out for each other, and children learned early that survival meant being part of a collective. The downside was the constant state of alertness required, especially for young kids who had to memorize these codes before they fully understood why their neighborhoods operated like resistance cells. This communication system worked because it was community-driven and adaptive, evolving whenever law enforcement or hostile outsiders figured out the current terminology. Families would test their children on these codes the way other families might quiz kids on multiplication tables, because getting the message wrong could mean someone getting arrested, beaten, or worse. The mental burden of maintaining this parallel language, while also code switching between home dialect and the proper English, required in white spaces, created exhausting cognitive loads, particularly for young people trying to navigate multiple worlds simultaneously, moving to something even more domestic. Number 18. Strategic name selection. Parents deliberately chose names that wouldn't immediately signal race on job applications or housing forms. A child might be James on paper, but Jamal at home. This dual identity system was exhausting but practical in an era of open discrimination. Before fair housing laws had real teeth, landlords routinely rejected Black applicants sight unseen based solely on names. A neutral name could at least get you through the door for an interview or a housing showing. If my name is Shinka Shay and you call me Shay, not only have you disrespected me, you've disrespected my mother. The advantage was increased opportunity. Studies from the era showed that identical resumes with white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks than those with black-sounding names. The cost was the denial of cultural identity and the constant code switching required. Children grew up responding to different names in different contexts, sometimes not even knowing their real name until they were old enough to understand the strategy. By the 70s, the Black Pride movement was pushing back against this assimilation, with many families choosing explicitly African American names as political statements, but pragmatic parents still played it safe, knowing their children would face discrimination. This created generational conflict as young people rejected the compromises their parents made for survival. The psychological impact of denying your own name, the most fundamental part of identity, cannot be overstated. Speaking of getting through doors, number 17, community caravan patrols. Organized groups would drive through neighborhoods in decorated cars, ostensibly celebrating or spreading messages of unity, but actually serving as mobile surveillance against police harassment and outside threats. These weren't random drives. They followed specific routes at specific times, creating a predictable presence that discouraged both criminal activity and police misconduct. The caravans were too visible and numerous to be easily targeted, and their presence discouraged opportunistic criminals who preyed on black communities. Knowing police response would be slow or non-existent, cars would be decorated with signs promoting community events or political messages, giving plausible cover for what was essentially a neighborhood patrol. Kids loved participating because of the festive atmosphere, the music blasting from car speakers, and the sense of being part of something important and adult. Adults used the opportunity to check on elderly neighbors, identify houses that needed assistance, and maintain a visible presence on every block. The challenge was maintaining consistent participation week after week, especially as the novelty wore off and the time commitment became burdensome for families already stretched thin. There was also the constant risk that these caravans could be interpreted as provocative by police, leading to the very confrontations they were meant to prevent. Some neighborhoods faced retaliation, with participants being followed home and later harassed. These rolling demonstrations kept communities connected and vigilant, while creating records of who lived where and who might need help. But some protection happened at the retail level. Number 16, Black-owned business networks. Barbershops, beauty salons, and corner stores functioned as informal intelligence hubs and safe havens. Shop owners knew their regular customers intimately, could recognize strangers immediately, and spotted potential threats before they materialized. A child in trouble could run into any black-owned business and find immediate protection, no questions asked. Shopkeepers would call parents, intervene in conflicts, or simply provide refuge until danger passed. The economic benefit was keeping money circulating within the community, building black wealth despite systemic barriers. These businesses often extended credit to neighbors during hard times, cashed checks when banks were closed, and served as informal social service agencies. Barbershops in particular became legendary for their role as community parliaments, where men discussed politics, shared job leads, and mentored younger men. Beauty salons served similar functions for women, creating spaces where they could speak freely about their experiences and organize collective responses. The limitation was that these businesses were often undercapitalized due to discriminatory lending practices and vulnerable to the same systemic racism affecting their customers. Many operated on razor-thin margins, and economic downturns hit them catastrophically hard. Still, they formed a protective network that made neighborhoods feel safer and more cohesive. When these businesses closed, often due to urban renewal projects that were really Negro removal, communities lost more than commercial spaces. They lost their safety infrastructure. Meanwhile, schools required different tactics. Number 15, the buddy system enforcement. Children were never allowed to walk to or from school alone, regardless of distance. This wasn't helicopter parenting. It was a response to documented cases of black children being targeted by racist individuals or picked up by police on spurious charges like truancy, even when they had legitimate reasons for their whereabouts. Groups of kids walking together were harder to victimize and provided witnesses if anything did happen. Parents coordinated schedules meticulously to ensure coverage, with older siblings given explicit responsibility for younger ones, which carried serious consequences if violated. The system worked because it was universal. Every family participated without exception, creating overlapping networks of protection. If one child's BI3's na Wednesday, parent couldn't walk them, another family absorbed them into their group. The downside was the loss of independence and the underlying fear that necessitated such measures. Kids couldn't explore their neighborhoods freely, couldn't take different routes home, couldn't stop at friends' houses without pre-approval and notification. The spontaneity of childhood was sacrificed for safety. Kids today might chafe at this level of supervision, viewing it as controlling, but in the 70s, it was absolutely non-negotiable. The buddy system also taught children collective responsibility early. Your safety was tied to the group, and the group's safety depended on everyone following protocols. This collectivist orientation contrasted sharply with the individualism promoted in mainstream American culture, creating another form of cultural code switching that children had to navigate. Protection also meant controlling information. Number 14, dress code as shield. A devastating example: a 12-year-old boy stopped by police despite wearing Sperry topsiders and khakis and a polo shirt, with his shirt tucked in and belt on. His outfit was deliberate armor, an attempt to signal respectability and non-threat to authorities who routinely profiled black youth. The boy's confusion is heartbreaking. "I don't understand. I'm wearing Sperry topsiders and khakis and a polo shirt. It's tucked in. I have my belt on." He believed that looking a certain way would protect him because that's what his parents had taught him to hope. At 12 years old, he learned that what he was wearing would not matter. Families enforced strict dress codes anyway, understanding that appearance could sometimes mean the difference between being left alone and being harassed or worse, even if it provided no guarantee. Boys wore pressed clothes, avoided anything that could be labeled gang-affiliated, even in areas with no gang presence, and kept hair neatly trimmed. Girls wore modest dresses or skirts to avoid being labeled as promiscuous or inappropriate. The positive was instilling pride and discipline in presentation. The devastating negative was the lesson that even a perfect presentation couldn't guarantee safety, a lesson that broke something fundamental in children's understanding of fairness and justice. This created psychological damage, the understanding that their very existence was considered suspicious regardless of behavior or appearance. Parents had to watch their children learn that the world was fundamentally unjust while still trying to prepare them to navigate that injustice without being destroyed by it. The clothing requirements also created financial pressure, as keeping children in acceptable clothes required money that many families struggled to spare. Yet communities also fought back culturally. Number 13. Unofficial block captains. Every block had someone, usually an older resident with time to watch the street, who functioned as unofficial security and intelligence gatherer. They knew which cars belonged, which visitors were expected, when people normally came and went, and most importantly, when something felt wrong. These block captains would sit on porches or look out windows during daylight hours, creating a constant presence that deterred crime and documented police overreach. If officers harassed someone, there was a witness who could provide testimony. If a stranger prowled around looking in windows or testing doors, someone noticed and spread the word. The advantage was significant crime deterrence without relying on hostile police forces that often caused more problems than they solved. The challenge was the burden placed on typically elderly volunteers who sometimes faced retaliation from both criminals and police, who resented the scrutiny. Block captains who reported police misconduct sometimes received threatening visits or had their own homes targeted. This system only worked with universal community buy-in. Everyone had to respect the block captain's authority and contribute information. In return, block captains had to be trusted to use their knowledge responsibly, not gossip maliciously or play favorites. The role carried significant social capital, and competition for the position sometimes created friction. But mostly, communities recognized these individuals as essential infrastructure and supported them accordingly. But some tactics were more confrontational. Number 12. The porch light protocol. Specific patterns of porch lights being on or off communicated messages to neighbors about safety conditions on any given night. All lights off might mean police presence in the area. A specific combination could signal immediate danger. Lights cycling on and off indicated all clear. This visual code system worked because it was neighborhood-specific and constantly updated to prevent outsiders from deciphering the meanings. Unlike verbal codes, which could be overheard, or phone conversations, which might be monitored, light patterns were visible only to those who knew what to look for, and only worked within the line of sight of neighboring houses. In the 70s, these tactics became normalized parts of neighborhood operation. The benefit was silent, rapid communication that could alert an entire block within minutes without a single word spoken. The limitation was that it required everyone to constantly check and remember current codes, which changed periodically for security. It also required good sightlines. In denser urban areas or neighborhoods with many trees, the system was less effective. On less tense nights, the protocol also meant you knew which houses were safe to approach if you needed help in an emergency, as certain light configurations indicated willingness to provide refuge. Children were taught these signals as soon as they were old enough to be out after dark, with the understanding that recognizing the warnings could save their lives. Speaking of checking in. Number 11. Mandatory check-ins. Children had to report their location multiple times per day, calling home or checking in with designated adults at predetermined intervals. This wasn't about control or helicopter parenting. It was about knowing where your child was if something went wrong, whether that was an arrest, an injury, or simply getting lost in a confusing city. Before cell phones, this meant using payphones, stopping by relatives' houses every few hours, or having other parents relay messages through the neighborhood network. The system worked through redundancy. Multiple adults tracked multiple children, creating overlapping webs webs of accountability. The source material's description of 10-year-olds receiving the talk about police interactions shows exactly why this monitoring was essential. Children were at constant risk. Kids had to be accounted for because disappearances, false arrests, and violence were real and persistent threats, not paranoid fantasies. The positive was enhanced safety and community connection that made children feel supported rather than surveilled. The negative was the constant reminder that danger lurked everywhere, even in their own neighborhoods, which created ambient anxiety that many carried into adulthood. Today's youth might find this level of oversight oppressive, but it demonstrably saved lives and prevented families from experiencing the nightmare of not knowing where their child was when police or hospitals called. The check-in system also taught time management and responsibility. Kids learned to plan their activities around check-in times and to take seriously their obligation to the adults who worried about them. Meanwhile, transportation required careful planning. Number 10, coordinated travel routes. Families mapped safe routes through neighborhoods and shared this intelligence systematically, creating informal but detailed guides to navigating hostile urban terrain. Certain streets were avoided after dark because of poor lighting or the presence of hostile groups. Specific corners were known trouble spots where drug deals or violence regularly occurred. Particular areas attracted police harassment. This wasn't paranoia. It was based on documented incidents, often tragically learned through someone's bad experience. Creating safe routes through this hostile territory became essential survival knowledge passed down like family recipes. Parents would drive kids to activities rather than let them walk through risky areas, even when this created significant time and gas expenses. Teenagers learned which bus routes to take and which to avoid because certain buses passed through territories controlled by different gangs or hostile white neighborhoods. The benefit was genuine harm reduction. People avoided dangerous situations by simply not being in dangerous places. The cost was severely restricted mobility and the time burden on parents who essentially had to escort their children everywhere, functioning as unpaid chauffeurs on top of their other responsibilities. This created additional economic pressure on families already struggling, as parents had to arrange work schedules around transportation needs or pay for gas they could barely afford. The mental mapping required was extensive, not just knowing current dangers, but tracking how they changed over time as neighborhoods shifted. But some protection was more subtle and insidious. Number 9. Respectability, politics enforcement. Communities policed themselves harshly to avoid giving racists ammunition for their prejudices or excuses for violence. This meant strictly controlling children's behavior in public, maintaining properties meticulously even when landlords neglected basic repairs, and avoiding anything that could be labeled as disturbing the peace or confirming stereotypes. Even accusations of being loud or disruptive could bring disproportionate police violence, so families enforced codes of conduct that would seem excessive in white neighborhoods, where similar behavior went unpunished. Kids couldn't play too loudly in yards. Music had to be kept at volumes that wouldn't carry to white-occupied spaces. Gatherings couldn't look like parties to outside observers. The advantage was reducing police interactions and neighborhood raids that traumatized entire communities. The severe disadvantage was the psychological burden of constant self-monitoring and the implicit acceptance that Black people had to be better just to be treated equally, or more accurately, to be treated slightly less badly. This bred significant resentment and sometimes broke community bonds when people failed to meet impossibly high standards and were criticized harshly by their own neighbors. The politics of respectability also created class divisions within Black communities, with middle-class families sometimes distancing themselves from poorer neighbors whose behavior they felt reflected badly on all Black people. This internalized respectability became a form of oppression itself, with communities enforcing white standards upon themselves. The psychological damage was compounded by the fact that respectability often didn't work anyway. The 12-year-old in perfect preppy clothing still got stopped by police, proving that no amount of conformity provided actual protection. Yet practical measures continued. Number 8. Cash-only economics. Many families avoided banks and formal credit systems that discriminated against them systematically, operating instead primarily in cash transactions. This protected against predatory lending practices and denied institutions the ability to track and control Black economic activity as thoroughly. Bank loans were denied to qualified Black applicants, or came with interest rates of 13% versus 4% for white neighbors with identical financial profiles, making formal banking a trap rather than a resource. Cash transactions meant no paper paper trail for authorities to exploit, no credit scores that could be tanked by discriminatory reporting, no bank accounts that could be frozen on suspicious pretexts. Black-owned businesses often operated similarly, creating parallel economic systems that functioned outside white institutional control. The benefit was financial autonomy and avoiding discriminatory practices that would have made economic advancement impossible. The risk was significant vulnerability to theft, since cash couldn't be recovered. If stolen, inability to build a documented credit history that would be needed for major purchases like homes or cars, and extreme difficulty making large purchases that required documentation. By the 70s, some civil rights legislation had improved banking access nominally, but distrust remained deep and often justified as discriminatory practices simply became more subtle. This cash culture also meant neighbors lent to neighbors at fair terms, creating informal credit unions and rotating savings groups that provided capital when formal institutions refused. These underground economies demonstrated remarkable sophistication and trust, with complex lending arrangements managed entirely through verbal agreements and community accountability rather than contracts or collateral. Moving to educational strategies. Number 7. Underground academic support networks. With public schools hostile or indifferent to Black student achievement, communities created comprehensive after-school and weekend learning programs. The honors classes in high schools that were 90% African American were somehow 90% white, revealing systematic exclusion from advanced education rather than any actual difference in student ability. The speaker notes pointedly, "Your child really is not that smart," challenging white parents' assumptions that the racial composition of gifted programs reflected merit rather than bias. Parents and community members therefore supplemented inadequate education, teaching history that schools omitted or distorted, providing tutoring in subjects where Black students were routinely told they couldn't excel, and preparing kids for a world that would systematically underestimate them. These programs operated in churches, community centers, storefronts, and private homes, often with volunteer teachers who worked full-time jobs and then donated evenings and weekends to education. The benefit was actual education versus the babysitting that passed for it in underfunded Black schools with outdated textbooks and demoralized teachers. The challenge was the enormous time and resource burden on already stretched communities, and the fact that these programs, however excellent, couldn't provide official credentials or placement in advanced tracks. But they worked. Many successful Black professionals credit these programs with their achievement and their ability to navigate higher education when they got there. The programs also taught pride and accurate history, countering the systematic message from official curricula that Black people had contributed nothing to civilization. Yet some tactics were grimmer and more explicitly defensive. Number 6. The Legal Defense Contact List. Every household maintained updated phone numbers for lawyers who would take civil rights cases and criminal defense for Black defendants, often provided by the NAACP or local activist organizations. These weren't high-powered corporate attorneys. They were often barely paid or volunteer advocates who believed passionately in the cause and understood the systematic injustice built into the legal system. Having these numbers immediately accessible meant that if police violated someone's rights, there could be a rapid legal response rather than having to search for representation while someone sat in jail. Freedom rides and civil rights activism showed the absolute necessity of legal defense infrastructure. Without it, activists and ordinary people alike would have been ground up by the criminal justice system. By the 70s, this infrastructure had evolved from emergency response to a permanent community fixture, as routinized as having a doctor's number. The benefit was some protection against the most egregious abuses and someone who understood how to navigate a hostile legal system. The limitation was that many families couldn't afford actual legal representation beyond initial advice. So these contacts only helped with the most clear-cut cases of injustice where pro bono work was possible, or where the case had publicity value. Still, having any access to legal knowledge was infinitely better than having no recourse at all and facing the system completely alone. These lawyers also educated communities about their rights, conducting workshops and publishing pamphlets that armed people with knowledge even when they couldn't afford representation. Meanwhile, social practices evolved complex protective functions. Number 5. The doorway assessment. Before opening any door to anyone, families looked through windows, peepholes, or security chains to verify visitors' identity and intent. Police and hostile individuals often used deceptive tactics to gain entry, posing as utility workers, claiming to have information about relatives, or simply demanding entry without proper warrants. Children received absolute instructions never to open doors without adult permission under any circumstances, even if someone claimed to be the police. The police harassment and brutality explain this vigilance. Forced entry was common, and once inside, authorities authorities could plant evidence or claim observations that justified arrests. Even seemingly innocuous situations, an actual utility worker, a salesperson, a neighbor's relative, required verification because Black families had been targeted through such ruses repeatedly. The benefit was preventing forced entry and the violent incidents that often followed. The downside was living in a state of siege within your own home, treating every knock as a potential threat. Today, this seems paranoid. In the 70s, it was reasonable caution based on documented dangers. Front doors had multiple locks, and families fortified windows not just against crime, but against police who sometimes simply broke in. This constant wariness took a significant psychological toll, creating anxiety disorders that were never diagnosed or treated because mental health services were unavailable or hostile to Black patients. But adaptation continued. Speaking of psychological impacts. Number 4. Strategic documentation. Families meticulously documented everything. Police stops with badge numbers and exact times, discrimination incidents with names and locations, property damage with photographs when possible, creating paper trails for potential legal action. Cameras were expensive in the 70s, and film had to be developed, making photography a significant investment. But when possible, photographic evidence was crucial. More commonly, detailed written records were kept in notebooks specifically designated for this purpose, stored carefully because they represented both hope for future justice and current danger if discovered by authorities. The racial covenants still being physically present in property deeds as late as 1970, sometimes just crossed out with a pen, show why documentation mattered critically. These records proved patterns of harassment and discrimination rather than isolated incidents that could be dismissed. The benefit was evidence for lawsuits and civil rights complaints that might someday receive a fair hearing. The limitation was that documentation alone rarely brought justice in the 70s, where courts and police review boards were themselves discriminatory. But having no records meant absolutely no chance at all. This practice also served psychological purposes. Writing down injustices validated experiences that authorities routinely denied or minimized, and it created a sense of agency in situations where people otherwise felt powerless. Communities sometimes pooled documentation to show systematic discrimination affecting entire neighborhoods, building cases that individual incidents couldn't support. Now for something more culturally specific. Number 3. Church as command center. Black churches functioned as far more than religious institutions. They were comprehensive organizing hubs, informal legal clinics, food banks, employment agencies, and physical refuge. Gospel music provided strength and community during civil rights struggles, and by the 70s, churches maintained and expanded that central role in community infrastructure. They coordinated neighborhood watches, managed bail funds, provided meeting space for community organizations from voter registration drives to youth programs, and offered sanctuary when needed. Pastors often had connections to lawyers, politicians, and activists who could help families in crisis, functioning as brokers who connected people with resources. Churches ran schools that supplemented inadequate public education, operated food pantries that prevented hunger, and provided counseling services that addressed mental health needs that mainstream medicine ignored. The benefit was comprehensive, wraparound community support that addressed multiple needs through a single institution. The challenge was that not everyone was religious or attended church, and church politics sometimes complicated assistance as competing congregations or denominations created friction. But even non-religious families recognized churches as safe spaces and essential community resources that they could access in emergencies. This infrastructure, originally built during slavery, when churches were the only institutions enslaved people controlled, refined through Jim Crow when they remained autonomous spaces, continued protecting Black neighborhoods when all other institutions failed them. Churches were also financial institutions, with credit unions and savings programs operating through them. Yet some tactics were deeply personal and psychologically complex. Number 2. The comprehensive survival talk. The multi-year education in police interaction is given to children. This wasn't a single conversation, but an ongoing training covering multiple scenarios with the thoroughness of emergency response drills. Parents taught what to do if stopped while walking, while driving, in groups or alone, how to respond to accusations, questions, and commands. They role-played scenarios repeatedly, drilling responses until they were automatic and reflexive. Do whatever they say, no matter what they say, was the core message, encompassing submission to illegal searches, false accusations, verbal abuse, and physical humiliation because survival outranked civil rights, dignity, or justice. Parents had to teach explicitly that the justice system wouldn't protect them, that authority figures were threats rather than help, and that their Blackness was perceived as criminality regardless of actual behavior. The benefit was preparation that genuinely saved lives by preventing the instinctive human responses, running, arguing, defending oneself, that got Black people killed. The catastrophic cost was embedding trauma while still in childhood, childhood, teaching profound distrust of all institutions and communicating that society viewed them as inherently criminal suspects. The exchange between parent and child in the source captures the permanence of this burden. After the 12-year-old is stopped by police despite a perfectly respectable presentation, he asks, "How long will this last?" His mother responds, "For the rest of your life." This answer crushes hope that things might improve, that eventually he could relax his guard, that growing older might bring safety. It teaches that this hypervigilance is permanent, not a childhood precaution to outgrow. Finally, the most impactful and foundational measure. Number 1. Fictive kinship systems. Fictive kinship is called the fundamental concept enabling all other protective strategies. This was treating non-biological community members as actual family with all attendant responsibilities and privileges. When everyone was genuinely auntie, uncle, cousin, or play brother, entire neighborhoods functioned as extended families who protected each other's children unconditionally, shared resources without expectation of repayment, and provided comprehensive mutual aid. This wasn't metaphorical or casual usage. It created functional family structure with real obligations. If your parent was arrested, neighbors took you in without question or time limit. If your family lost income, others provided food and money without making you feel like a charity case. If you were threatened by anyone, any adult would intervene as fiercely as if you were their biological child. The source asks audiences to think of people they call family, who aren't biologically related. This practice was universal in Black communities, but formalized and strengthened far beyond similar white practices. This system had deep roots in African traditions, where villages collectively raised children and communal ownership was normal, and it was strengthened through slavery when biological families were deliberately destroyed and refined through segregation and Jim Crow when isolation from hostile white society necessitated complete self-reliance. It reached perhaps its peak functionality in the 70s before economic pressures deliberately introduced by policy decisions and the crack epidemic of the 80s began fragmenting these bonds. The benefit was comprehensive mutual support and protection that made survival possible under impossible circumstances. The challenge was that it required universal participation and broke down when individuals prioritized personal advancement over collective welfare, or when poverty became so severe that people had nothing left to share. But when functioning properly, fictive kinship created villages that raised children communally, protected the vulnerable, mourned collective losses, celebrated collective victories, and resisted systematic oppression through absolute solidarity. This was more than a survival tactic. It was the preservation of humanity and culture in circumstances explicitly designed to destroy both. The source's speaker notes establish fictive kinship with her audience, saying, "I'm going to assume that we're all family now, and in this fight together." This invitation extends the protection of these networks beyond racial lines to anyone willing to participate in collective liberation. Fictive kinship meant that no child was orphaned, no elder abandoned, no family left to starve, no person left to face danger alone. It was the foundation that made everything else possible. Well, that's it for this video, but don't go anywhere because we've got plenty more heat for you. Just tap any of the cards on your screen right now and keep it locked. Bus segregation. You couldn't sit just anywhere on the bus. You remember that, don't you? The front rows were reserved, white only. If you were Black, you sat in the back, and even then, you'd better stand up if a white passenger needed your seat. The seats weren't just divided by a line. They were divided by centuries of arrogance and fear. The air was thick with the hum of the engine and the silent calculation of dignity versus safety. You didn't argue. You just moved, even when it burned your pride. Now, you hop on a bus today, sit where you like, scroll through your phone, and think nothing of it. But back then, every step toward that front seat could get you arrested. Or worse, can you imagine how heavy those simple rides felt? Water fountains. You couldn't drink from the same water fountain. And it wasn't just about thirst. It was about humiliation. The white fountain was cool, chrome, and spotless. The colored one, usually off to the side, was old, chipped, maybe barely working. It didn't just say, "You can't drink here." It said, "You are less." The sting wasn't in the water. It was in the sign. Today, when you grab a drink from a public dispenser or refill your bottle at the airport, do you ever think about how many people fought just to take a sip from the same tap as everyone else? Restaurants. You couldn't eat in certain restaurants. If you were traveling through the South in the 1960s, you had to plan your meals carefully. You carried food from home or relied on the Negro Motorist Green Book to find safe places to stop. Because most diners, even the ones that smelled like heaven with fried chicken and coffee brewing, would refuse you at the door. You might see the sign, "Whites Only," swinging gently in the wind above a neon-lit entrance. And even if hunger gnawed at you, you knew better than to walk in. If you dared to sit down at that counter, you'd face sneers, insults, maybe maybe fists. And yet, some did. Some sat anyway, quiet, steady, unshaken, knowing that their presence alone was an act of defiance. Think about that next time you order food from anywhere. No second thought about who's allowed to serve or sit beside you. Public parks and beaches. You couldn't take your children to every park or swim at every beach. Cities maintained separate recreation areas, white playgrounds with new swings and clean sand, and colored ones tucked in forgotten corners, with rusted slides and broken benches. Even water wasn't equal. Some beaches were patrolled by local police who made sure the line stayed clear. A rope in the water, sometimes invisible, sometimes enforced by men with batons, said you belonged only on one side. Imagine the sound of the waves, so free, so wide, and being told they weren't for you. Now, when you watch families gather under the sun without a second thought, you can't help but remember that there was a time when the ocean itself felt segregated. Movie theaters. You couldn't sit where you wanted in the theater either. In many southern towns, African Americans were sent upstairs to the balcony, what they called the colored section. You could hear the laughter, smell the popcorn, and feel the cool air from below, but you weren't part of that world. Sometimes you had your own entrance, a narrow stairway on the side of the building so you didn't pass through the main doors. The seats were older, the view wasn't as clear, but you still went, because escaping into a movie, even from up there, gave you a few hours where color lines blurred in the dark. Now you can walk into any cinema, sit where you please, lose yourself in the story. But back then, the story outside the screen was always the same. You were reminded of your place before the opening credits even began. Libraries and education. You couldn't use the same libraries or the same books. Some cities had entirely separate library systems. In others, you could only enter on certain days or check out books that white readers no longer wanted. Children would walk miles to small, underfunded colored schools, often sharing one textbook among several students. Pages torn, covers faded, but you studied anyway. You read by lamplight. You learned from hand-me-downs because knowledge wasn't just power, it was hope. And today, when you see a child tapping away on a school tablet surrounded by books and free Wi-Fi, you can almost feel the echo of what your parents and grandparents must have dreamed of, a world where learning didn't come with a locked door. Voting rights. You couldn't always vote, even though you were a citizen. On paper, the 15th Amendment said you could, but in practice, they made sure you couldn't. You remember the tests, don't you? Literacy tests that had nothing to do with reading and everything to do with humiliation. How many bubbles are in a bar of soap? Name all 67 judges in the state. If you stumbled, if you hesitated, they'd stamp denied across your name. Then there were the poll taxes. Small sums for some, impossible for others. You'd save pennies from your paycheck, only to watch the registrar tear up your application anyway. And yet, people kept trying. They stood in lines that stretched around courthouses, in the heat, in the rain, in the shadow of men with rifles, just to cast a single vote. Now you walk into a polling station and slide your ballot into a machine in seconds. But in the 60s, that act was a battle cry. Every X marked on paper was an act of courage. Hotels and travel. You couldn't stay just anywhere when you traveled. Hotels, motels, even gas stations had their unspoken rules. No coloreds, no Negroes. The Green Book wasn't a luxury, it was survival. You carried it in your glove compartment, thumbed through its worn pages, praying to find a safe bed for your family before nightfall. Picture this, the hum of the highway beneath your tires, the kids in the backseat asking when you'll stop, and the sinking feeling when you see another vacancy sign flicker off as you pull up. You'd sleep in the car sometimes, doors locked, a blanket across your lap, because even rest was segregated. Now you check into a hotel with a few taps on your phone, greeted with smiles at the front desk. But for many, that simple comfort was once a forbidden dream. Hospitals and healthcare. You couldn't be treated at every hospital. Many white hospitals refused to admit black patients, no matter how sick they were. In emergencies, you'd be turned away at the door, told to try the colored hospital down the road, even if that meant losing precious minutes. And when you got there, supplies were short, equipment outdated, and doctors overworked. Mothers gave birth in crowded wards. Children recovered in rooms without air conditioning. Even blood transfusions were segregated. They labeled vials by race. Think about that, segregating life itself. Now you walk into an emergency room and expect care, no questions asked. But back then, survival depended on your zip code and the color of your skin. Job opportunities. You couldn't apply for many of the jobs you qualified for. Employers would take one look at you, one glance at your address, and say, "We'll call you," but they never did. Factory work, sales positions, even clerical jobs, doors closed quietly, and when you did find work, you were paid less for doing the same labor. Some towns even had white job listings in the newspapers. Black workers were kept to janitorial or field labor, no matter their education. Yet you showed up every morning, pressed your shirt, did the work, because dignity didn't depend on permission. It came from endurance. Today, job applications applications are online. Names are typed, not spoken. Bias still lingers, but the walls aren't as visible. Still, can you feel how heavy it must have been to walk into an interview knowing the outcome before you even sat down? Clothing stores. You couldn't try on clothes in certain stores. Imagine walking into a shop, running your fingers over a new dress or suit only to be told you can't put that on. They said it was about hygiene, but you knew better. It was about control. You could buy it if you had the money, but you couldn't test the fit. So you'd hold the fabric up to your shoulder, estimate in the mirror, and hope it looked right once you got home. There was a quiet shame in that, but also defiance, because you were still claiming space in a world that wanted you invisible. Now you see fitting rooms lined up, mirrors bright, clerks smiling at everyone the same way. But back then, even fashion carried the sting of segregation. Swimming pools. You couldn't swim in most public pools. Some cities drained the pools completely when integration was ordered, just so white families wouldn't have to share the water. Imagine that, choosing to destroy something rather than share it. In many neighborhoods, the colored pools were smaller, old, or non-existent. You'd swim in rivers or creeks instead, places that carried both freedom and danger. But those moments, kids splashing, mothers laughing, were acts of rebellion. Joy became its own protest. Now, community pools are just another summer stop. But when you close your eyes and listen to the sound of water today, remember, once it echoed with the weight of exclusion. Public restrooms. You couldn't use every restroom. Traveling across the South, you'd see those signs again. White and colored. The white bathrooms were cool and clean. The colored ones, if they existed at all, were usually behind the building or in disrepair. For Black women especially, that humiliation was relentless. To be denied basic human needs, to hold it in while watching others walk freely in and out, it was a small cruelty repeated 1,000 times a day. Now, public restrooms are everywhere, shared by all. But every door that swings open today carries the memory of those that once stayed shut. Churches. You couldn't worship everywhere. Even the house of God was segregated. Some churches outright banned Black congregants. Others created separate entrances or designated pews in the back. But faith doesn't bow to barriers. So Black communities built their own churches, places that became more than sanctuaries. They were schools, meeting halls, headquarters for the movement. When the world refused your humanity, the church reminded you of it. Now, when gospel choirs and church bells ring across all colors and congregations, you can feel the echo of those who refused to let segregation reach their souls. Amusement parks and fairs. You couldn't enjoy the same rides or attractions. White-only parks posted guards at the gates. For Black families, that meant watching laughter and music from beyond the fence. Some parks had colored days, usually once a year, an insult wrapped in charity. So you made your own joy. You built your own carnivals, your own fairs, your own spaces where children could run free. Joy became a declaration. We exist, we feel, we celebrate. Now think about the ease of buying a ticket to Disney or Six Flags without fear. The laughter is the same, but the freedom behind it was paid for. Marriage and relationships. You couldn't marry freely, not if the person you loved was white. In many states, interracial marriage was illegal until 1967, when the Supreme Court finally struck those laws down in Loving v. Virginia. But before that, loving someone across color lines could mean arrest, exile, or violence. Black and white couples lived like fugitives in their own country, sneaking away to other states to say their vows, knowing their union wouldn't be recognized back home. Families were torn apart, communities whispered, and lawmen made examples of them. Now, love is still not always met with acceptance, but at least it's legal everywhere. You can hold the hand of the person you love in public without fearing the sheriff's car pulling up beside you. But for those who lived before 1967, love itself was a rebellion. Neighborhoods and housing. You couldn't buy or rent just anywhere. Realtors, banks, and city zoning laws worked together to keep Black families out of white neighborhoods. They called it redlining. Entire maps were drawn with red borders, marking the areas where banks wouldn't lend to Black buyers. Even when you had the money, you were told, "This house just sold," or "We're not taking new tenants." If you did move in, harassment followed. Slashed tires, broken windows, or worse. The American dream had boundaries that didn't appear on paper, but you could feel them every time you tried to cross. Now, neighborhoods are more mixed, but the echoes of those maps still shape where opportunity lives. Every time you see a house with a "for sale" sign, remember those who couldn't even get their foot in the door. Schools and integration. You couldn't send your child to every school. Even after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the reality of integration moved at a snail's pace. In the early 60s, many southern states openly defied the ruling. Some shut down public schools entirely rather than allow black and white students to learn side by side. So you saw brave children, just kids, walking through mobs, escorted by soldiers, books clutched to their chests. They faced screams, spit, and thrown stones just to sit in a classroom. Think about that. They were children asking for nothing more radical than an education. Now kids ride the same buses, share classrooms, and complain about homework together. But it's because those before them walked through fear so others could walk through open doors. Police and justice. You couldn't expect fair treatment from the law. The badge didn't mean safety. It meant danger. A routine stop could end in jail or worse. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't reach for your pocket. You didn't even run if you were innocent. Because in the eyes of the system, your innocence didn't matter. The jails were full of people charged with disturbing the peace or loitering, crimes invented to remind you that your freedom was conditional. Even black veterans returning from war, men who had fought for the country, were beaten for wearing their uniforms in the wrong town. Now the conversations about justice still echo, but at least the law can be challenged, recorded, exposed. Back then, silence was your only witness. Voting juries and civic duty. You couldn't serve on juries, even though verdicts affected your life. All white juries decided cases involving black defendants, and the outcome was almost always the same. Guilty. It wasn't justice, it was performance. Your civic duty was stripped away before it even began. You paid taxes, worked, lived by the law, but the law didn't see you as part of it. You were a subject, not a citizen. And yet the fight for inclusion didn't stop. Black lawyers, activists, and organizers filed lawsuits, built coalitions, and forced the country to confront its hypocrisy. Now, jury duty might feel like a chore to some, but to those who remember that era, being called to serve means something sacred. It means you finally have a voice in the system that once shut you out. Barbershops and beauty salons. You couldn't go to every barbershop or salon. The white-owned ones refused to cut black hair, claiming they weren't trained for that texture. It wasn't just about grooming, it was about dignity. So black entrepreneurs built their own spaces, and those spaces became community sanctuaries. A haircut wasn't just a service, it was connection, laughter, advice, debates about politics and sports, and the soothing buzz of the clippers. It all lived there. Black barbershops and beauty parlors weren't just businesses, they were survival centers. Now, you see stylists of every background learning to work with every texture, but the pride that came from creating your own space? That's the part that never changed. Public transportation beyond buses. You couldn't ride trains or airplanes the same way either. On trains, the colored car was always near the back, hotter, dirtier, noisier. Dining cars often refused black passengers altogether, forcing them to bring food from home. Air travel was worse. Many airports in the South had segregated waiting areas and bathrooms. Some airlines quietly denied black passengers boarding if seats were overbooked, always choosing to bump them first. Flying, that symbol of freedom, was just another reminder of limitation. Now, when you pass through airport security, boarding pass in hand, think about those who were grounded long before the plane even left the runway. Public pools and country clubs. You couldn't join most country clubs, swim teams, or golf courses. Leisure wasn't considered your right. If you wanted to play, you built your own. Black golf leagues, community centers, small private clubs made from nothing but willpower and a patch of land. Even tennis courts were contested ground. Players like Arthur Ashe broke through barriers not just with skill, but with composure under open hostility. His victories weren't just athletic, they were political. Now, when you see athletes of every color playing side by side, it's easy to forget how recent those locked gates were. But every open clubhouse today stands on the shoulders of those who built their own when no one would let them in. Military service. You couldn't serve equally in the armed forces. Though integration officially began in 1948, discrimination lingered well into the 60s. Black soldiers were given the hardest, most dangerous assignments. Promotions came slowly, if at all. In some bases, even the mess halls were still divided by race. And when they came home, medals on their chest, honor in their stride, they couldn't eat in the same restaurants as the white men they fought beside. Think about that. To defend freedom abroad, only to be denied it at home. Now, the military is one of the most integrated institutions in America, but every salute, every uniform today still carries the memory of those who saluted equality before the nation did. Shopping and department stores. You couldn't walk freely in the big department stores downtown. Even when your money was good, your presence wasn't welcome. Security guards followed you through aisles, clerks ignored you, dressing rooms were off limits, and restrooms were marked for white ladies only. So black shoppers learned to navigate the insult. Polite smiles, quiet dignity, eyes straight ahead. You bought what you needed, but never forgot the sting behind the transaction. The act of spending your own money became an act of quiet protest. Now everyone strolls through malls and stores without thinking twice. But for those who lived through it, consumer freedom came wrapped in the memory of exclusion. Workplace segregation. You couldn't rise in the rank. Even in industries that hired black workers, promotions had ceilings. The boss might say, "You're a good worker, but this position isn't for you." White employees with less experience were given titles, while you were told to be grateful. So you worked twice as hard for half the recognition, not because you were accepted, but because you had something to prove to yourself, to your children, to history. Now, corporations boast diversity programs, but the fight for equal opportunity began with those who refused to be silent in the face of invisible walls. Every office today stands on their shoulders. Sports and public games. You couldn't play on the same teams or even in the same stadiums. Colored leagues and white leagues divided athletes by race, no matter their talent. Black players weren't allowed into the major leagues, country clubs, or Olympic training camps, but they played anyway, on dusty fields and backlots, on cracked asphalt courts. And when one of them, Jackie Robinson, Wilma Rudolph, Muhammad Ali, broke through, it was more than victory. It was vindication. Now stadiums roar with unity. Jerseys are sold across the world, and every child, no matter their color, dreams of greatness. But that dream was built on decades of closed doors and stubborn persistence. Freedom of movement. You couldn't simply wander. Police had the power to stop you, question you, demand to know why you were out of your area. Sundown towns made it clear, if you were black, you'd better be gone before dark. So every drive, every stroll after work carried calculation. Which streets were safe? Which towns would look the other way? You learned to move with purpose, never lingering, never assuming safety. Now, freedom of movement is taken for granted. You walk where you please, day or night. But the memory of those curfews still lingers in the quiet corners of America. Everyday dignity. And maybe that was the cruelest part. You couldn't exist freely. You couldn't laugh too loud in the wrong place or challenge a white person's word. You couldn't forget yourself, not even for a sec. Dignity itself was a daily act of resistance. Every handshake, every church service, every bus ride, it all carried risk. And yet, people didn't just survive. They thrived, they loved, they built, they sang, they prayed, and they passed down stories of how they kept their humanity intact when everything around them tried to take it away. Now, when you look around at what's possible, the open schools, the shared neighborhoods, the laughter in public parks, you realize something simple but profound. None of it was inevitable. It was earned. Music and nightlife. You couldn't dance where you wanted to, not in the clubs where the bandstand gleamed under the soft gold of stage lights. In most towns, the music belonged to white patrons, and even when the sound was born from black rhythm and pain, you weren't welcome on the dance floor. In the 1960s, black musicians could headline a white club, but after the last song, they had to leave through the back door. You could be the one making the crowd move, the sax wailing, the bass trembling through the wooden floor, but you couldn't sit down at the bar for a drink. In many southern towns, even the local mixed dance halls had clear codes. Black patrons on weeknights, whites on weekends. The jukeboxes, too, told their own truth. In white diners, they'd remove race records, claiming they were too raw. Today, when you step into a cafe, plug your phone into a Bluetooth speaker, and play whatever song you love, it's hard to imagine that there was a time when sound itself was segregated. Back then, a black artist could be the soul of America's music and still be denied entry to the very spaces their art transformed. Do you ever think about how many songs were written in rooms that wouldn't have let the singer sit down? Movies and entertainment. You couldn't watch a movie just anywhere. Theaters were split down the middle, or worse, stacked. White patrons got the main floor. Black patrons were sent up to the balcony. They called it the Peanut Gallery, a name that stung as much as it mocked. The smell of buttered popcorn drifted up, but the view wasn't the same. You had to crane your neck, looking past the heads of others to see the screen below. Even the stories on that screen didn't belong to you. Hollywood in the 1960s was still painting the world in white, keeping black faces to the margins or making them caricatures. Sidney Poitier was one of the few who broke through. Graceful, dignified, but always carrying the burden of representing an entire people. Now we sit on equal seats, side by side in the dark, and streaming lets every story find its voice. But back then, watching a movie wasn't about escape. It was about endurance. You paid for a ticket just like anyone else, but you were still reminded, frame by frame, that this world wasn't built for you. Do you remember the first time you saw someone who looked like you on screen and didn't feel invisible? Public transportation. You couldn't travel freely, even when you had the ticket. Trains had separate cars. Buses had dividing lines that weren't just painted, they were enforced. In southern stations, white and colored waiting rooms meant you couldn't sit with your own family if your skin was the wrong shade. Imagine standing on a platform under the beating sun, holding your child's hand, knowing the cooler waiting area beyond the glass was off limits. You heard the laughter of passengers inside, the hiss of steam, and you felt the weight of being told, yet again, to wait your turn. The insult wasn't just in the inconvenience, it was in the daily erosion of dignity. Today, trains hum quietly across the country, and you can board without a second thought. But back then, every trip required calculation. What route was safe? What towns to avoid? Who might stop you? You weren't traveling for leisure. You were moving through a map of danger. Can you imagine planning a simple trip and needing courage just to sit down? Religion and church life. You couldn't even worship together. On Sundays, when church bells rang through small southern towns, they rang for two congregations divided by color. The white church stood on Main Street, proud and tall. The black church sat farther off, maybe near the railroad tracks, its paint peeling, but its heart alive. But here's the truth. The separation birthed something powerful. Black churches in the 1960s weren't just houses of prayer. They were fortresses of community. Inside, people found not just God, but each other. The scent of perfume mixed with wood polish, the hum of the choir swelled like thunder, and for a few hours, you were reminded that your life still had worth. While white America worshipped comfort, black America worshipped survival. Those pews held the first whispers of revolution, the same voices that would march in Montgomery and sing in Selma. Now you can walk into any church you choose. But back then, the black church wasn't just a sanctuary, it was the soul of resistance. Do you remember how every hymn sounded like both a prayer and a promise? Military and war service. You couldn't fight for your country on equal ground. During the Vietnam War and the years before it, black soldiers often faced two battles, one overseas and one the moment they came home. In World War II, segregation in the ranks was official. By the 1960s, it was supposed to be gone, but racism didn't evaporate with policy. It lingered, in promotions denied, in barracks divided, in medals unawarded. You might have worn the same uniform, carried the same rifle, and bled on the same field. But when you returned to your hometown, the same old signs still greeted you. Whites only. Imagine risking your life under a flag that didn't protect you at home. Even on base, there were unwritten rules. White officers gave orders, black soldiers carried them out. Yet, in the face of all that, many still served with pride, because serving meant believing in a version of America that hadn't yet arrived. Today, when we see veterans honored with parades and ceremonies, it's easy to forget that not every hero was welcomed home. Some had to march for equality after marching for their country. Can you imagine the strength it took to salute a nation that refused to salute you back? Closing reflection. So, the next time you sit at a counter, vote at a booth, walk into a hotel, or drink from a fountain, pause for a moment. Remember those who couldn't. Remember the mothers who packed lunches for the road, the fathers who walked miles to vote, the children who sat in classrooms surrounded by hate but refused to quit. Their courage didn't just open doors, it built the floor you stand on. Because the truth is, the 1960s weren't just about what African Americans couldn't do. They were about how they refused to stay that way. Every barrier became a battlefield, every humiliation became history, and every act of defiance became freedom. Now it's your turn to carry their memory forward. If you remember stories from your parents, your grandparents, or your own life, share them. Drop them in the comments so they're never lost to time. Because memory is power, and power, once shared, never fades. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.